Hey, and welcome to God Speaks Today with me, Andy Croft. I work for a church in Watford called Soul Survivor. And what we're doing in this series is we're allowing the Bible to speak into all sorts of subjects and topics that are really relevant for us in life today. And the one we're going to look at today is the subject of power. And I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently, and there's a number of things that have triggered it for me. The first is a conversation I had with a friend, and he was telling me he works in a quite a high-powered work kind of environment, and he was saying that he just recently had to go into the boardroom. And when he was in the boardroom, he had to defend his job and the team that he's responsible for to the board, and he said he had to be quite forceful about that, or it felt almost aggressive. And he was just saying he came out of there having had to do that, to fight for the jobs of the people that he was over. And he said he just didn't feel like that was very Christian, that he was just struggling with the dynamic there. There have been a number of other people I've spoken to who've had a similar questions about how am I meant to be a Christian in the workplace when there's this kind of dynamic to power that's happening. And alongside having those conversations, I also I've been reading the books of the Kings. I don't know if you've ever read those books, but they're pretty intense. And there's a popular TV show around at the moment called Game of Thrones, which is all about this kind of brutal kind of power fight for who's going to be in charge. Well, the books of the Kings can give the Game of Thrones a run for its money. It's probably a lot worse. And as I was reading it, and I read of king after king after king who just isn't able to handle power, I began to think, gosh, as people, we have so much to learn in this area. So that's why I want to talk about power. And to begin with, the first thing for us to get is that this is relevant for all of us. This isn't just something for people that are in charge of armies or economies. This understanding of what power is and how we are meant to use it is something that matters for every single person. And there are two types of power, just broadly speaking. One is institutional power, which is the sort of power that you might find in structures. So if we're an employee or we're an employer, there's a power dynamic there. If you're a teacher and a student, of course, there's a power dynamic there. Someone in the police force, there's government, there's all these structures that are set up that are institutional. And within those structures, there, of course, are power dynamics. And so all of us as people probably will have, well, all of us must, we have to interact with those structures in some way, shape or form, whether we're in the middle of them or we're on the receiving end of certain things. And so that's one understanding of power, institutional power. And a second one is relational power, which is something that in every relationship there's a dynamic of power. And so you would know this in any sort of experience. You've arrived somewhere and you're a guest, and someone else is the host. And so immediately there's a dynamic there, isn't there? If you're new to a group or you're new to a church, then the people who are already there have the power to welcome you in or not to do so. If you're a foreigner and you visit another country where you don't speak the language, again, you immediately feel vulnerable, don't you? I've been to France, and my French extends as far as un baguette s'il vous plaît, and after that I'm stuffed, and so instantly I'm feeling vulnerable there. In a relationship where it's a parent-child, you might have a little baby and you're the one that changes the nappies. Well, one day that's going to shift and you'll be in nappies, and hopefully your baby will change yours, or they'll be grown up by then. But there's power in all of our relationships, and so whether we're an employee, we're a grandma, we're a friend, or we're a boss, all of us are going to have to figure out and reflect on how we're going to handle power. And for the rest of this talk, I just want to look at two things, really. The first one is, negatively, what are the danger areas when it comes to power? Why are we so susceptible to being corrupted by it? And secondly, more positively, how can we handle power? And so first of all, what are the danger areas? Why are we so vulnerable when it comes to being corrupted by power? And there are two reasons. The first one is we live in a fallen world. And so in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve reach out their hands for the fruit. And as they do that, that's a power play. They want to become the powerful people. They're reaching out to become like gods. And in reaching out, they set a pattern there in Eden that has been something that the rest of the human race has followed in. So often what we do now in our world, which is a fallen world, is we reach out to grasp power. And there's another TV show that's been quite popular in recent years called House of Cards. House of Cards is about a guy called Frank Underwood, who's a congressman at the start, and he gets passed over to be Secretary of State. He wants to be Secretary of State. And so the rest of the series of House of Cards is about how he schemes and manipulates his way into getting ever more power. And let me read you a quote. He's a wonderfully evil kind of character in a sort of a Macbeth way. And so you get drawn into his story, which is quite dark. But there's this thing that he says at the start of one of the seasons. It says, "Every kitten grows up to be a cat. They seem so harmless at first, small, quiet, lapping up their saucer of milk. But once their claws get long enough to draw blood, then sometimes they do that even from the hand that feeds them." And then this is the key bit. "For those of us climbing to the top of the food chain, there can be no mercy. There is but one rule: hunt or be hunted." And of course, that isn't describing the whole of our world, but it's not hard to see that rule at practice in so many places. It's a hunt or be hunted type of world. And because we live in a fallen world and we see that fairly regularly all around us, that can almost be the model that we adopt, and we can begin to think that the only way I'm going to get ahead in this world is if I start to be like the world and I adopt this principle of hunting people or being hunted myself. So that's the first reason why we're a little bit vulnerable, the environment that we're in and what it models to us. The second reason why we're a little bit vulnerable is because we have fallen hearts. It's not just about the world that we live in, it's about what lives in us. And someone said it's a bit twee, but I think there's truth in it. The heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart, that we are easily led and we are easily corrupted. And there have been lots of things that have talked about the nature of power and how it corrupts. There's a little saying, all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Lord of the Rings is a great story that's all about the nature of power. The central thing in it is the ring of power. And in the course of the story, the good characters are trying to destroy it because they know that it's got this ability to corrupt. And Frodo, the little hobbit, offers it to a number of the wise characters. One is Gandalf the wizard. And so there's this whole scene where Frodo reaches the ring out to Gandalf and says, "Take it, Gandalf, take it, it's right here." And Gandalf says, "Don't tempt me, Frodo." And then he says, "You don't realize that I would take this, I would reach out to grab it out of a desire to do good. But after a while, I would be corrupted by it." There's another scene with Galadriel, she's called, this great powerful elf queen. And Frodo offers it to her, and she's just in this having internal battle. And in the midst of it all, she kind of just imagines what it would be like to have the ring of power. And she said, "I will become this great and terrible queen." And then she says this phrase, "All would love me and despair." And they both pass the test. They refuse the ring because they know that though they would reach to take it from good intentions, it has this ability to corrupt and twist the human heart. And isn't that true in what we see in the world around us, in modern history? You can see that yesterday's freedom fighters are today's tyrants. And all you need to do is look at the killing fields of Cambodia or the gulags or the Holocaust to see that as a human race, we have a terrible ability to abuse power. We live in a fallen world with fallen hearts. And there are two other things that you chuck into the cocktail that's going on here that also means that we are susceptible to being corrupted by power. One is pride. Lots of us struggle with pride. I know I do. And what happens is as we gain power, so often we become proud because we are powerful, whatever that looks like for us. And so you see examples in the scriptures of people that are corrupted. So one would be Samson. You can read about him from Judges 13 onwards. And he's given the amazing gift of superhuman strength. That would be cool, wouldn't it? If that was a fruit of the Spirit today, how good would the church be at rugby? But Samson's given the fruit of the superhuman strength. And after a while, he just becomes so arrogant because of his strength, because of his power. Nebuchadnezzar is another example. You can read in Daniel chapter 4 about how he's really king of the whole world. And one day he's on the top of his palace looking around at what he's built, and he says something about how it's all for me and I'm so awesome. And at that point, God steps in and humbles him. When we grow in power, we can begin to think it's about us, and we can begin to glory in our own strength. In my own pathetic little way, I have so often fallen into this trap. And I remember there was a time I was giving a talk at one of our festivals that we have in the summer. It was a seminar. And I remember doing the seminar and it didn't really go how I wanted it to go. And I got quite upset about that, probably because I had too much of myself wrapped up in how well it went. And I remember going to this room and hanging out with Mike Pedavacci, who's a great friend of mine. And I was really upset. I was actually crying because it had gone so badly. And I remember just being this mess, and Mike sort of standing in the corner looking at me thinking, like, what have I done to you, was what he kept saying, and trying to call my wife, trying to get her over because he realized I was in a bad way. And then I said to him, and I'm embarrassed to admit this to you, genuinely embarrassed, but I said, don't worry, Mike, and I sort of dried my eyes like a hero and said, I will rise like a phoenix from the ashes from this defeat. Makes me want to throw it when I think that I said that now. And I remember him just looking at me very kindly and saying, it's actually not about you, Andy. And at that point, I started crying all over again. But I remember realizing as I reflected on that, gosh, I've made this so much about me and how I'm doing and my identity. And that's how pride and power go together. They mix, and then you think it's all about your strength. C.S. Lewis has this scene in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader where Eustace goes and finds this dragon's cave with dragon's treasure in it. He lies on the treasure, and it says he falls asleep thinking the thoughts of a dragon, and then he wakes and he's become one. And in a world that glories in its own strength, if we lie in our beds at night dreaming those dreams, glorying in our own strength, then guess what? Sooner or later we wake and we've become like the dragons. So pride is in the cocktail, and the other thing that's also in this cocktail in a fallen world with fallen hearts is selfish ambition. And this is the thing in us, and we've all got it. It's that thing in us that you want to be in the in group. You want to be in the in crowd, whatever your version of an in crowd is. For me, in my sad little world, the in crowd are the Christian speakers. And so I'm like, I want to be in. I want to be in. I want to be invited to those things. And I speak to myself and I say, Andy, don't be such an idiot. What are you thinking? It's not about that. And sometimes I listen to myself and sometimes I don't. But we all have that thing that it's like, we want to be a somebody. We want to be known. And so we think to ourselves, wouldn't it be great if my class was the best class in the school? Partly because we want our kids to do well, but also, wouldn't it be great if my class was the best class in the school? We think, wouldn't it be great if I did great in my exams? But also, because I just want to do well, but also, wouldn't it be great if I did great in my exams over and above everybody else? And the problem with wanting to be in that in crowd, and it's a desire we all have, is that if that's the driving force, then when you get in, if you manage to get in, then the pressure becomes you've got to stay in. And so any power that you get by being on the inside of a particular social group or the inside of a particular boardroom, if it's all about selfish ambition, then what happens, the power we have, we begin to use it so that we stay in. So all the power we have, we bend it towards our bettering of our own position or our protecting of our own position. We begin to see other people as competition, other people as threats, and it becomes all about me. I've got to angle every sentence that I say like a mirror so that it shows me in the best possible light. It becomes all about, hey, check me out. Look at my glory. All will love me and despair. So we are vulnerable to being corrupted by power because of this environment that we live in, a fallen world that models something, because of what's going on in our own hearts, a fallen heart that's easily led, because you chuck into that pride, which goes so often with power, and selfish ambition, which causes us to use it for our own gain. And you realize, gosh, if I'm going to handle power, whether that's in a relationship, in a friendship, in a marriage, as a parent, if I'm going to handle power as a colleague, if I'm going to handle power, whatever I'm doing, then I'm going to have to be on my guard because I am likely to be corrupted by it. So where's the model and what do we look to? The model, you may be surprised to hear, is Jesus. And there's so many places we could look, but I just want to pick one little passage, and you can find it, if you have a Bible, you can find it in Matthew chapter 20. And in Matthew chapter 20, James and John and their mum approach Jesus. And I love this because it just cracks me up. They get their mum to ask Jesus for a better position in heaven. So if there's one thing that says to me, you are not ready for a promotion, you are not ready for a position of power, is that if you're getting your mum to ask for it for you. But nevertheless, that is what they do. And then the other 10 disciples are very frustrated by this. And it says in Matthew 20, verse 24, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So he points to the world around them. He says, you see this world, you see Frank Underwood's hunt or be hunted world. It's not to be like that with you. You are to aim to serve, because that's what I've come to do and to be. I haven't come to be served, but to serve. And that isn't something that Jesus just talks about. That's something that Jesus lives. So let me read you another scripture. This is from John chapter 13. It says in John 13, verse 3, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped about him. Don't miss that word so. It says there, Jesus knew that he'd come from God. So like he knew that everything had been made through him, all the planets, all the stars, everything in the universe had been made through him. Not just that he had like an impressive CV at his previous job. It's like everything was made through him. He knew that. Another thing he knew is that he was going to the Father. So he knew he was going to go and sit at the right hand of God Almighty, that he was going to judge the living and the dead, it says in the Bible. Everyone who's ever lived, from Caesar to St. Augustine to Bono to Barack Obama, they're going to stand judgment before him. He knew that he was going to sit on that throne. And also it says he knew that the Father put all things under his power. So, the fish and the birds and the mountains and the trees and the lakes and the oceans and the planets and the stars and the cosmos, all things under his power. And then it says so. Because of that, because of this knowledge that he was all powerful, he got up and he washed their feet. God serves because he is all powerful. And that's such a mind bender for us, because what we think is, because I'm powerful, people should serve me. And that's not how it works. Because God is all powerful, he chooses to serve the other. And ultimately the way he did it is through the cross, where he allows us to take him, nail things through his hands and feet, shove a crown of thorns on his head, strip him naked, humiliate him, beat him, and execute him. He allows us, the most powerful being in the universe, submits to us in that way. Why? The answer has to be love. But also in that you see that he models something for us. He shows us the safe exercise of power. And if we want to use power well, because power can be a creative force for incredible good. It's not a bad thing in and of itself, but if we want to use it for good, then we have to understand that the safe exercise of power, the Christ-like exercise of power, the godly exercise of power, is to serve. It's to be servant-hearted. And how that works out in practice, I've just got two suggestions as we come into land. The first tip is this: remember who we serve. There's a friend of mine called Thomas, and I use him as one of my many claims to fame, because Thomas was in Harry Potter 2. Unfortunately, he didn't have a very big part. He was an extra. If you watch Harry Potter 2, you can see the back of Thomas's head for 2/3 of a second in one of the classroom scenes. But let's say that one day after filming Harry Potter 2, Thomas came into my school and he said, "Look, guys, I've just hired the cinema in Durham, which is where I'm from. Come on down. We'll watch the premiere of Harry Potter together." And so we all arrive at the cinema. And imagine if there was a red carpet there, and then Thomas pulled up in a limo, and then he got out and he started forcing people to take selfies with him. And then we went into the cinema in Durham, and Thomas got up there in front of the screen and said, "Wow, my word, making Harry Potter 2 was such an experience. I learned so much." And then we all sat there and we watched the film, and we saw the back of his head for 2/3 of a second. How would we react? We'd think, you're an idiot, Thomas. We think, what are you doing? This isn't about you. This is about Harry Potter. It's about Daniel Radcliffe. He's the star. You're just an extra. And yet so often what we do is we make it about us, the world and everything that's happening is all about us. If we were to watch the film of eternity, we might just see the back of our heads for 2/3 of a second, but we are not the star. He is the star, and ultimately we serve him. Now, it's incredible that he serves us, that he describes himself as our slave. That's the phrase he uses. But Jesus also wants us to understand that we are to be slaves, that we are to be servants. And one of the most common examples of someone who's given power in the New Testament comes with this word steward. And what happens is someone's given power for a certain season, but ultimately there's still a master to whom they give account. And the master one day will return and will ask the question, what have you done with the power that I've given you? That's how it's going to work. Remember who we ultimately serve. He has given us a small amount of power, perhaps in the lives of some of our friends, perhaps in the lives of some of our colleagues. He's given us a small amount of power for a season. But one day, he is going to call us to account, and he is going to say, what have you done with that power? Remember who you serve. It means that we stay correctable. It means that we stay teachable. It means that we stay humble. And the second practical tip for how we handle power well is remember that we are blessed in order to be a blessing. 3 examples of people that lived in palaces: Joseph, Esther, Daniel. All of them are given those positions in a palace that they might serve the people who are outside of the palace. And there's this great quote I remember reading in a Tim Keller book where he talks about how we are to use our position to serve others. He says this: unless you use your clout, your credentials, and your money in service to the people outside of the palace is a prison. It has already given you your name. You may think that you have been given little because you are always striving for more, but you have been given much, and God has called you to put it into play. It is natural to root your identity in your position in the palace, to rest your security in the fact that you have a certain measure of control over the variables in your life, to find your significance in having clout in certain circles. But if you are unwilling to risk your place in the palace for your neighbors, the palace owns you. And what he says is the palace can become a prison unless we're willing to risk the power we have to serve those who are outside of it. How you do that, how you bless others with the power that you've been given, there's all sorts of really simple, really practical ways that you can do it. Another book on this, Richard Foster's book on power, talks about how we can serve people, and he just makes some really obvious suggestions. He says, value their opinion, acts of common courtesy, simple acts of kindness, guard their reputation, have integrity of life. You can do it through your honesty, through your truthfulness, through your dependability. And these things, they sound simple, so we are tempted to think of them as unimportant. But it's a really, really simple way that we can use what we have in order to bless others. So if we want to use power safely in a Christ-like way, then we need to learn how to use what we have in order to serve those around us. And the final question I would have, I know if I was watching this, is I would be thinking, well, what about the ambition that's in me? I really want to go for it. I want to make a difference. I want to have an adventure. I want to build the kingdom of heaven. What do I do with all this desire? Is that wrong? And no, that isn't wrong. Martin Luther King asks this very question in a speech that he gave. And he talks about, he says, everybody wants to lead the parade. Everyone wants to be the drum major is the phrase that he uses. We all want to set the beat for the band. We all want to be at the head. And he says, it's good that you want to be first. It's great that you have that desire to be important. But then he goes on and says this, but if you want to be first in love. If you want to be first, then be first in service. If you want to be first, then be first in caring for the other. Because that's how the Lord that we follow chose to live his life. We walk in the steps of a crucified Savior, a servant king. And if we as the church, if we are his people, then we are to reflect that to the world around us. In a world where it's hunt or be hunted, in a world where so often the temptation can be to get power over others, to get control over others, that we might manipulate them to do our will and to satisfy our needs. If we're going to be different, if we're going to be salt, if we're going to be light, the way that we do that is through serving them. Let me leave us with one final scripture. This is from Philippians chapter 2. I'm going to start reading in verse 5. And it says this: in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Or another way of translating that is something to be grasped. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. He died when he was 33 years old. He had a small bunch of followers that towards the end were a bit of a disaster. And he never seemed to have left a region of about 200 miles. And yet, he's the most influential person to ever walk the earth. And so if we want to make a difference in this world, and if we want to make an impact on eternity, what do we think the way to do it might be? I want to suggest that he is the way, and his way is to serve. If you want to handle power well, serve. In your marriage, in your friendships, in your church, in your office, serve. Remember who you serve and use it to bless other people. This has been God Speaks Today. Thanks for joining us.